The first garment we're going to make is the jacket. We'll create this by tracing a pattern much like how a seamstress would trace a sewing pattern. Let's get started. Start by switching to the animation module and import the model from DAZ. Because it's a DAE file, we have to set the units to millimeters to import the scale correctly. If this were an OBJ or an FBX, we'd import as centimeters. A DAE file will import the model and the animation along with it. Scrub the timeline to see the animation playing in the viewport. Switch back to the simulation module and let's save the scene as a starting point. I'll show you two ways of laying down a pattern to trace. Click on the Draw Rectangle tool, hotkey S, and draw a swatch in the 2D viewport. This will be a trash swatch that we're using only to drop a texture onto. Load the jacket pattern included with this download and set the width and height to 237 centimeters. I've predetermined that 237 centimeters will fit this pattern to the model. If you're using your own pattern, you may have to scale differently. As you move the swatch, the pattern will follow it. You can use the Transform Graphic tool to reposition the texture on the swatch. Press play and you'll see the swatch drop to the ground. That's method 1 for laying down a pattern to trace. Now delete the swatch and the texture is removed with it. The second method is to use a background. Right-click anywhere in the 2D viewport and add background image. Click the folder icon and open the jacket pattern. Set the scale to 98, which will correctly scale the pattern to fit our model. Turn off the 2D grid to have a better view of the pattern. Select the Polygon tool, hotkey H, and trace the pattern. Click only on the hard angles. We'll come back to add the curves later. Drop the opacity to make it easier to see the pattern underneath. Select the Edit Curve Point tool, hotkey V, and click and drag anywhere on the line to change its curve. If you're having trouble putting the curve points exactly where you want them, right-click in empty space and turn off Smart Guide, Snap to Pattern, and Snap to Grid. Repeat this process for the rest of the pattern pieces. Here, it's difficult to pick the point on the right and adjust it because the pattern piece is actually underneath the pattern on the left. We need to bring it above the other piece to make it easier to edit. Right-click and select Order, Bring to Front. We'll see more examples of this later on. Continue adjusting the lines to match the pattern. I'll speed up the video and finish adjusting the lines. If you have a segment point that is in the way, you can right-click on it and convert it to a control point. The same goes for converting a curve point into a segment point. Click the Smooth Curve tool, then click and drag on a segment point to turn it into a smooth curve. To make it easier to distinguish the front from the back, let's change the color. Click the Back tab and unclick Use Same Material as Front. Next, place the pattern pieces as I do around the body so that when sewn, they will all merge into a cohesive pattern. This first piece is the back panel. The next two are the side panels under the armpit. And this is the front. Grab the pocket cover, the two arm pieces, and the collar and move them out of the way. Select all pattern pieces and right-click Symmetric Pattern with Sewing, hotkey Ctrl D. Select all the pieces that were moved to the sides, right-click on one, and select Freeze, hotkey Ctrl K. We'll attach these pieces to the main body of the jacket later. I'll change the color to make the front-facing pieces more visible compared to the body. Here, I've switched to the Sewing Segment tool. I'm highlighting edges in the 2D viewport and watching in the 3D viewport to see if I've arranged my 2D patterns correctly. It looks correct, but give them more space so they're easier to work with. Right-click the 2D viewport, add background image, and click Reset to remove the pattern. Right-click the 2D viewport and turn on Show Line Length, hotkey Shift-Z, to compare the lengths. Sewn edges need to be very close to the same length to prevent bunching when sewn. Select Segment Sewing, hotkey N. When you mouse over an edge, you'll see a notch on the sew line depending on which end of the line you hover over. When you click to sew, these notches must be on the same end or the sewing will be twisted. This sew line is too long on one side. Select Edit Sewing, hotkey B, to adjust any sew lines after they've been placed. When moving an edge, a blue dot will appear showing you where an even sew length is. Or you can use free sewing to trace non-uniform distances. As of version 8, you can also sew in the 3D viewport. This can make sewing complicated parts much easier. Don't miss connecting your shoulders. In the viewport menu, toggle on Show 3D Threads. You can see here that my sewing notches weren't on the same side, and now my sew line is twisted. I'll sew it again, but more carefully this time. Good, much better. Look over the model and check for errors. Now for the front, we'll add a narrow line to emulate a button closure. Select the internal polygon line tool, hotkey G, and draw a narrow line on the front piece. Sew these two together with the sew notch on the left side. This is used to hold the jacket closed in place of a button for now. We're ready to simulate for the first time. In case things go very badly, it's good to always save before doing this. Now simulate. That's not what we want. Undo to the previous state. We're going to need some pins to get the jacket to wrap correctly first. Hold W and click on the pattern at the shoulder seam. Any spot that's pinned will not move during the simulation. Sim again. Good, now at least it didn't slide down. Next, remove the pins. Right-click on the garment, go to Pin, and delete all pins. Sim again and everything will fall into place. It's not pretty, but it's a start. Look around the garment to see how everything came together. With the main body in place, next we need to attach the arms. Unfreeze the parts that make up the sleeves and move them into place. It can be awkward trying to rotate them correctly depending on what gizmo you're using, but as long as they're roughly in place, it's fine. You can toggle the gizmo between world space and screen space under Preferences. Select the main body and freeze, Ctrl K. This is done so the pattern doesn't move while we attach the arms. Sew the panels together. Pin the sleeve top before attaching it to the jacket and sim. I'm changing the fabric color here so I can more easily see the pattern break up. This will be helpful later when we sew the armpit. With the simulation running, click and drag the garment to adjust the fit. The shoulder doesn't have the same split points as the main body. Don't worry about lining it up correctly on the first try. We can edit the placement at any time. Now use the seam edit tool to slide the sewing so it correctly lines up. The pin is no longer needed. Delete it now. I'm watching both the 3D and the 2D viewports to determine what pieces match and which direction to sew in. Approach one part at a time and it won't be too difficult. I'll split this edge to add a segment point so it's easier to match patterns. In the 3D viewport, click on the pattern. A blue dot will appear on the corresponding piece in the 2D viewport. Click on the Edit Pattern tool, left-click to select the line only, then right-click at the blue dot location and split. I'll pull the split out just enough to give it a slight angle. Continue around the rest of the arm, always sewing from the shorter segment to the longer segment. I'll arrange the patterns to make this difficult area easier to work on. Continue tracing the line with your mouse in 3D, and check in 2D which direction to sew. Make sure it's selecting the shorter segment and not the long way around. This tool will sometimes make that mistake. Take it slow and carefully work through this part. Good job. That was one of the more difficult things to do. This side is a mess now from having been frozen while the other side was sewn. Delete the entire other side and duplicate it over like before. Move it into position. Because we duplicated with sewing, all of the panels that we just worked on are sewn together. Only the middle and front need sewing. Sew these together now. Now that we have most of the pattern pieces in place, I'll clean up the layout and save the scene. I need to add a fold line for the collar. Bring in the background image again and align the pattern to it. Lower transparency to make it easier to see the pattern. Select the internal polygon line tool and draw a line for a fold. Move the collar into place and do the same for it. Good. We're done with the background now. Right-click Add Background Image again and click Reset to remove the pattern. I'll put the opacity back to 100%. Select the fold edge and change the fold angle to 360 for now. To prevent pieces from moving around, work localized and freeze all the parts that aren't involved in folding the collar. With the simulation running, click and drag the fabric to help it fold. The stitch in the front is blocking the fold. Select and move it down. Good. Now play the simulation again. Toggle sim on and off while dragging the fabric around. Despite setting the fold angle, it's difficult to fold it over. To help us, we'll use pins. Hold down W and click on the fabric. Drag the pin where you want the fabric to move. The rear pattern color is too similar to the pin color. I'll change the fabric color to make it easier to see. Now freeze the side we just finished. Hotkey Control K. Now fold the collar on the other side. Sometimes it can be helpful to hide the avatar and some back clothing pieces and work from the back. In the 3D viewport, select Show Avatar, hotkey Shift-A to toggle visibility. Select some of the back patterns and toggle their visibility, hotkey Shift-Q. And finish folding over the collar. In the 2D viewport, select everything, right-click and select Show All 3D Patterns, hotkey Shift-W. And toggle avatar visibility as well. Next, we need to attach the collar. But first, let's change the pattern color to something that isn't similar to the frieze color. Now select the parts around the collar and unfreeze. Unfreeze the collar as well and move it into place. Move the other collar into place too, but leave it frozen for now. Sew along the back of the collar first. Because the pattern is frozen, the stitching is still active. When the simulation runs, it pulls the jacket to the frozen collar. Activate it, then select Deactivate Pattern and Sewing. Select the internal line, then set the fold angle, and fold the collar over. We've missed a sew line. Undo and sew the remaining segment. The other side is causing problems again. Activate it, and select Deactivate Pattern and Sewing. We're a little short on length, so let's extend the collar. To do this, temporarily draw a sew line to find the missing distance. The sew line shows a value of 2.45 centimeters. We need to extend our collar by that amount. Select the edge, right-click, and select Pattern Offset. Enter the value you measure, and also select Extend Side Segments. This will project the shape and angles from what's already there. Select the segment points, right-click, and convert to curved points. Select the Edit Sewing tool, hotkey B, and move the sew lines to the new distance. Now set the rest of the collar. Now sew the rest of the collar, and move the end of the fold line, snapping it to the edge of the collar. That collar is still causing us problems. Select it and delete it for now. Fold the collar back down. Our fold lines are a little out of alignment. Adjust them so they rest right on the natural edge. I'll pull the edge out to give the collar more room. Make sure you adjust the stitching to match. With that collar looking good, duplicate with stitching and move to the other side. Sew the middle line. Now let's work on the shoulders. Clothing is tailored to fit in a relaxed pose with the arms down. In order to shape the shoulders correctly, we need to rotate the arms down. To do this, we'll use the animations we prepared in DAZ. Drop the opacity and switch to the animation module. Scrub the timeline to watch the animation play. Then move the time slider back to frame 0. Set the end frame to 30. We want the animation to stop playing when the arms are rotated fully down. Switch back to the simulation module. Click Play Motion and select Yes at the prompt. Once the arms are down, press Play Motion again to stop the animation. We have some obvious wiggle in the armpits. This is a very difficult area, and in Marvelous Designer, it's very important to learn how to troubleshoot problems like this. Watch while I speed up the video to troubleshoot this area. During this process, I'll pull on the fabric, adjust the particle distance, and check the sew lengths. Besides the wiggle, there's a bit too much fabric in the armpit as well. We'll remove some of this later on. There, deleting the upper sew line fixed the problem. I'll move the pattern out to have a better look at the seam. It looks fine. I'll sew this again to see if the problem is fixed. Checking between the 3D and 2D viewports to what part to sew to. Good, much better. Look over the garment to identify what needs to be done. I'll fix this panel length now. Switch to Edit Sew and mouse over the sew line to see the distance. It shows 58.49 for my pattern, which means I need to shorten this longer side to that length. Right-click the edge, select Change Length, and enter the measured value. Notice that because we shortened the edge, the sew line was shortened too. Drag the ending of the sew line to the end of our new edge length, and it will be a perfect match. Next, I'll make an expansion flap at the back of the jacket. Instead of deleting the old stitching and re-sewing to a shorter length, use the Edit Stitch tool again and move the sew line up. Simulate to see the pattern separate. I'd like the lapels to cover more of the chest area. Bend the fold line to see how this affects the lapel. Moving out appears to expose more of the chest. Bending in covers the chest better. I'm looking carefully at the model, and I don't see any bad parts. Take your time and inspect the seams. The shoulders are a bit droopy, but it's progressing well. It's a good time to save. I'll change the color to something more pleasing. The backside color too. That looks better. Override the material assignment on the underarm pattern. Good. Next I'll attach the pockets. Grab the pocket patterns and drag them into place. The pockets are going to be sewn equidistant across two pattern pieces. That means we need to measure the pocket flap width and split the distance in half and sew one half to each pattern. Move the pocket approximately where you want to attach it. Drag the pocket pattern up closer as well. Press Shift-Z to show the line lengths. In the 3D viewport, click on the pattern and notice the blue dot showing at the corresponding location in the 2D viewport. Draw the first internal line from this spot. Don't worry about the correct length for now. It can be adjusted later. Take a look at the pocket width and remember the length. In my case, it's 10.72. Open a calculator and divide 10.72 by 2. So 5.36 is the length I need to make my two internal lines. Select the line, right-click, and change length. Set the value to 5.36 centimeters. Select the line, copy, then paste it to the adjacent pattern piece. Watch in the 3D viewport as you move to see exactly where to put it. Be sure the end of the line is snapped to the edge of the pattern. Sew the segment lines together from outside to inside. Double check that the internal lines are placed properly to the edge of the pattern. Click the pocket flaps, unfreeze, and simulate. Good, they're attached correctly. Work at whatever particle distance is responsive for you. A real jacket typically has an inner layer as well as an outer layer. In Marvelous Designer, we need to mimic this in order to give our jacket a sense of weight and thickness. If we simulate it only as a single thick fabric, it will look very artificial and thin. Select everything but the pockets and right-click Layer Clone Under. This will create a duplicated pattern that is automatically sewn to the original pattern and stacked underneath the original garment. When I move the arm pattern, you can see the stitch lines connecting the lower pattern together. Now select the pockets and Layer Clone over. And the same if you move a pocket. You can see that it is sewn to the one underneath because of layer cloning. Let's save again. Run the simulation and let the two layers solve. It looks like there's some fighting in the collar. To fix this, we need to set the layer order. The dark color is the back of the fabric. The lapel is dark, so we have to think about the layer order backwards. The dark piece is under, so that's layer 0. The light piece is over, so that should be set to layer 1. The pockets I'll set to a high layer order because I know they will always be on top of everything else. Sometimes you'll need to move pieces out and let them restack. Good. Next I'll fix the drooping shoulders. A suit shoulder has some reinforcing pads in the shoulders. We'll mimic this now to create a better shape. To do this, I'll duplicate parts of my pattern and cut out sections to stack. The stacked fabric will push the shoulders out and help it to retain the shape. Select the outer patterns around the shoulder and hide. Hotkey Shift Q. Right-click an edge and offset as internal line. Set the distance to 1. Repeat this for all the upper parts of the shoulder. Next, draw an internal line segment perpendicular to the new line near where the shoulder pad would be. These internal lines will be where we cut the pattern apart to create the shoulder pads. Repeat this process, working your way around the remaining pieces. While doing this, be sure to delete any unnecessary lines. Delete the extra point and slide the line into place. And again for the last part. Select the 3 pattern pieces, right-click, and layer clone under. Select the lines and right-click Cut. If you have an error when you're cutting, it may be because your line segment doesn't reach the edges of the pattern. Sometimes drawing a new line in place of the old will fix this. Delete the leftover pieces. They are no longer needed. Move the new parts close to the shoulder patterns. Remember, because these were layer cloned under, and because we cut the patterns, there is some leftover messy stitching. With the Edit Sewing tool, delete the sewing left over from the layer clone. Restitch the pieces. Depending on how your lines were drawn, the sewing tool can jump around or not connect how you might have thought. Take your time and carefully sew them together. Select the new parts and duplicate to the other side. Move them into place and enable transparent surface in the 3D viewport. Hotkey Alt-4 to more easily see them. Before I simulate, I'll save again. The shoulders are still flimsy looking. We can fix that by moving the padding location during simulation. Click the Select Mesh Box tool and select all the pads. Simulate and slowly move the pads up. You can see that they slide back down when you let go. This is because we need to freeze them into place. Once you move them back into the correct spot, press spacebar to stop the simulation before letting go of the mouse button. Good, now freeze them into place. Hotkey Ctrl-K. Show everything again with Shift-W. For now, I'll freeze and focus only on one side. Because of instance and linked editing, the top layer of the clothing has a stitch line for the shoulder pads. We want to remove that. Select all the top pieces and right-click Remove Linked Editing. Now, on the bottom pattern, I can delete all the unnecessary internal lines. The shoulder pads look to be poking through the outer layers. Simulate to see the results. Hide only the outer patterns covering the shoulder pads. Select the frozen shoulder pads and move them down slightly. Sometimes the bottom layer may jiggle a little bit. This is fine as long as it doesn't cause the pattern to tangle in itself. Another technique we can use is pattern stacking by layer cloning under multiple times. Select the shoulder pads, right-click, and layer clone under. Simulate after each clone to give your fabric a chance to move up and check the results. Repeat the process and stack as many times as you need. Clone, simulate, repeat. That looks pretty good. Now I'll set the particle distance to something lower and examine how it looks. Making good progress. I'll save again. Select all of the old side and delete it. Select the remaining patterns, right-click, and select Remove Linked Editing. Then right-click again and click Symmetric Pattern with Sewing. And move it into place. If not done already, set the pocket flaps to a high layer order. I set mine to 5 and 4 respectively. Select one side of the jacket front and set its layer order higher to prevent layer fighting. Remember to do this for both the inner and outer layers. I'll set mine to 3 and 2. Set the other side, inner and outer, to 1 and 0. Now to finish the back seam. When stitching the back together, a message may pop up saying overlapping sewing line. This will happen when you try to sew together something that already has a sew line attached to it, as in the case of layer cloning. This is usually fine because the garment is already holding itself together. Select all the patterns and set their particle distance to 15 and simulate again. Everything's looking good. Next, the collar. Stitch the middle line of the collar together. Now unfreeze the collar and simulate. With that done, take a minute to look over what we've made so far. Looking good. Save again. Next, we're going to fix the collar line. Select all the pattern pieces, freeze everything, Ctrl K. Select the left half and hide, Shift Q. Select the top pattern's collar and lapel, right-click and activate it. Right-click again and deactivate pattern and sewing. And finally, hide it. Select the remaining collar and lapel and activate it. Toggle avatar visibility, hotkey Shift A, and any of the back pattern pieces that are in the way, Shift Q. With those pattern pieces out of the way, we can start fixing the collar pinch. Select the fold lines and change the fold angle back to 180. And let the clothing return to its natural position. Adjust the fold lines to where the clothing would naturally rest. Click in the 3D viewport to use the blue dot as a guide. With that moved, simulate again to see how it lines up. That'll work. Clean up the rest of the curve. Select the two lines and set the fold angle to 360. Good, something a bit lower now. Next, select the top pattern and overlay the patterns and make sure the fold line is in the same place. Enable Snap to Pattern to make snapping to the line easier. Then lower the opacity so you can see where to move the line to. And finally, move the fold lines from the internal layer to match the new lines on the external layer. With the lapel fixed on the outer layer, we need to freeze it and force the inner layer to solve to it. Freeze the external pattern, select the internal pattern, unhide with Shift Q, right-click and activate it. And finally, simulate. It's having some trouble simulating correctly. Stop the simulation and disable the pockets for now. We want them out of the way while we set the layer orders. The top pattern lapel should be set to layer 2, and the bottom pattern lapel set to layer 1. Do the same for the collar. Good, now it's simulating without error, but in the wrong order. Change the bottom pattern lapel and collar to layer 3 and simulate again. Good, now everything is layered correctly. Next, we need to simulate the lower pattern. Freeze the upper pattern pieces and unfreeze the lower. Simulate again. Good, with that sorted, select the pocket and activate. Ctrl J. Select everything and set the layer order to a neutral 0. Also unhide and unfreeze everything. Save again before simulating. Good, everything's simulating well. It looks like the collar is inflated. We'll come back to this shortly. If not done already, slide the stitching up again to make room for a flap. Before we finish this flap, let's go back and sew the collar. For both the lapel and the collar, sew their fold lines together. Good, that looks better. Now back to the flap. Back to the flap. Select the Edit Sewing tool and select the shorten line length to determine where to split. Press Z to switch to the Edit Pattern tool, right-click and split. Show line length again, Shift Z. With the Rectangle tool, hotkey S, draw out a swatch approximately as tall as the segment we just split. Right-click on the line, select Change Length, and type in the value to get the exact length. The start and end options will change which way the length is pushed. Sew the flap to the jacket pattern. Hide the avatar and move the flap piece into place. Check which direction it's facing and rotate so the front side is facing the correct direction. Simulate and it'll move into place. Now layer clone under and simulate again. Good, that part is done. Save the scene again. Next, some more work on the shoulder. I'll select everything and change the particle distance to 10 in order to see a slightly better preview. It's all starting to look pretty good, but our shoulder is sticking out harshly. We're going to rebuild the shoulder pads. Sometimes it may be necessary to redo parts for the sake of ultimately making the garment better. Let's make it a bit broader and longer so there's not such a harsh edge to it. Do like as before, but this time offset the internal lines to 1.5 centimeters instead of 0.5. Draw perpendicular cut edges further out this time. Delete the old stitch lines. Layer clone under, select the cut lines, and cut. Again, make sure your cut line ends are snapped to the edges. Cut and delete the extra parts. Delete the old middle parts for now. Sew the new piece to the pattern. You can try turning up the pressure setting to have the fabric push out. I only want to work with one side for now, so select the other side and deactivate pattern only. Simulate and see how it looks. Set the fabric preset to wool coat weight. I'll stack these new pads for now. I'm not sure I like it with the two pads. I'll delete the second pad for now. Hide the outer layers if you want to more closely examine how the shoulder looks. I'll layer clone under one last time on the top shoulder pads to push it out a little bit more. I'll layer clone under one last time on the top shoulder pads to push it out a little bit more. It looks pretty good. I'm happy with the new pad shape, but the position could be improved. Edit stitch and slide them into a better position. Now let's shorten the other pads and the stitching to match. Stack the new pad onto the pattern and move the internal lines to match. If the bigger pattern is in the way of selecting your pad, right-click on the pattern and select Order, Send to Back. This changes the stacking order in the 2D viewport. Before we're finished here, edit the stitch lines to the correct length. If you have two overlapping sew lines, a menu will automatically pop up, allowing you to pick which line you want. Delete the old pads and simulate again. Take a minute to review the changes. There's still a bit of slop in the shoulders. I may need to move and freeze the pads later to get a better shape, but for now, I'll leave them stacked. It's looking pretty good. I'll save again. On the other side, delete the extra pieces. Delete the old part and duplicate the new piece to the other side. Move it into place and sew onto the arm pattern. Next, we need to push that new pad into place. Freeze everything on the left side and unfreeze the newly moved shoulder pad. Hide any patterns in the way. Run the simulation and let it settle into place. Now unfreeze everything and let the simulation run. Show everything and look over the work we've done so far. The shoulders are looking pretty good now. The armpit has too much fabric in it. Next, we'll do some surgery and make this fit better. Select the entire inner layer and deactivate pattern and sewing. We want a clear view of the armpit. Hide the patterns on the avatar. Look over the arm side of the armpit. Think about how much you want to cut off. Click on Line 3D Pattern. Now I'll draw directly on the garment where we need to cut out some fabric. Switch to the Edit Line 3D Pattern tool, right-click on the line and convert to internal shape. Drag your pattern line to match. Do the same for the other piece as well. Now select the inner armpit pattern and toggle visibility and freeze it. Show the back pattern as well. Hide any other patterns that are blocking the view of the armpit. Run the simulation and let the newly cut pattern settle into place. I'll delete the guideline now. It's no longer needed. Freeze the sleeve and unfreeze the body side armpit piece. We need to remove some fabric from the inside of the armpit pattern now. Look carefully and determine the areas you'll need to trim off. Toggle visibility of any pieces that may be adjusted next. Be sure to delete the internal shape line that you used as a guide. Repeat the previous steps and draw your guideline on the pattern. Finish the guideline and convert to internal shape. Drag your pattern edges to match the guideline. Unfreeze and run the simulation on each part to see if it's working well. Looking good so far. Now unfreeze the arm and simulate all together. Our cuts look successful. The armpit fits much better now. Let's change the fabric to something shiny and darken it to more easily see the wrinkles. I'd still like to remove a bit of fabric from the armpit. I'll move these points over, simulate, and check the results. I'm happy with that for now. Here I'm examining the shoulder area to determine how well it's working and if anything more needs to be done. Next, we'll add seam taping to strengthen the shape of the seams. Select the seam taping tool and click on the edge. Seam tape will be applied to all selected edges. This will help the seams retain their shape. The definition of seam taping is reinforce pattern edges to withstand gravity in a simulation. The shoulder front looks a little sloppy. I'll trim a little more off. Repeat the same process as before. I'll work on the shoulder a bit to try to improve it. Work on small sections, simulate, check your results, and adjust accordingly. There's some pinching here. I cut too much off. I'll undo to the previous edit and cut a little less. That looks better. Unhide all with Shift W. Select the top pattern pieces and delete. And layer clone under again. Let the sim run and sort the layers. The jacket is looking pretty good. Change the fabric back to matte. I want the lapel to cover more of the chest. Hide the back patterns and the avatar and drag the lapel edge towards the center. Increase the fold strength if the fold starts coming undone. Carefully look over the results. Everything's looking pretty good. Show all and save again. Now I want to add some memory folds to the lower arm. To do that, we need to bring in a model and animation pair to change the pose. Switch to the animation module. Import OpenColada and select the elbow bend file you made. Enable Load as Avatar, select millimeters, and click OK. Scrub the timeline to see the animation play. Remember that all of our animations move out of and into the starting pose. Switch back to the simulation module and click Play Motion. After a couple frames, the arms will begin to lift up. I'm looking for what creates the best wrinkles in the lower arm. This may be a slight bend, or it may be from a greater bend. I'll let the animation play again and try a lesser bend. There, that looks pretty good. There's a bit more wrinkling on the body side panels than I'd like. Select the panels, inner and outer patterns, and apply Strengthen. Freeze the collar so we don't disrupt the top. Now sim and pull down the cloth to remove the unwanted wrinkles. When you like what you see, stop the sim and freeze those pieces into place. Repeat for the other side. Select all those parts and right-click Select Solidify. Right-click again and unstrengthen. Solidify will keep the shape based on what strength amount you assign in the attribute. I'll set mine to 50. Remember to set this for all the panel pieces, inside and out. We're nearly finished. I'll save often from here on out. Unfreeze the collar. There's a bit of a problem on the right collar. I'll try pulling things into place, but it doesn't appear to want to cooperate. Sometimes it's easiest to delete the offending part and replace it. Let the sim run with the part missing to relax the fabric back into place. Then mirror the good side over. We need to remove linked editing before mirroring it. Move it into place and stitch the center if needed. There's a small kink in the collar that needs fixing. Hide anything in the way to get a better view of this part. I'm also checking to make sure the collar folds are stitched together. Good, they are. A little bit of pulling on the collar should fix this. There we go. Looks good. Save again. Everything's looking good. Just some last minute adjustments and we'll be finished. Hide the back patterns. Next we'll pin and move the lapel. Select Pin Box tool and in the 2D viewport, select some points near the fold. Run the simulation and change to Select Mesh Box tool. Click the pin points and move them. Update the selection as needed. Move in to cover more of the chest, but don't move so far that it creates an odd shape. It's looking good. Save again. Set the particle resolution lower to see a higher resolution version of the jacket. It's looking good. Now let's move the arms back down. Click play motion again and wait for the arms to rotate down. Oh, we forgot one important step. Undo the last sim and the arms will pop back to the bent pose. Don't worry, it's fine that the pattern arms and the body are out of sync for right now. Select all the arm patterns, right-click, and select Solidify. Go to the animation module and scrub back a couple frames until the avatar arms are back in the sleeves. Switch to the simulation module and let the animation play again. Now we have our garment back to the original pose and the arm memory folds are kept in place. Save again. Next, we're going to remove some wrinkles from the sides. Select the offending pieces, right-click and strengthen. Because these parts already have Solidify enabled, they won't change shape even when we pull on them. Select the pattern pieces and disable Solidify. Simulate again and pull into place. The strengthen setting will help remove wrinkles, and Solidify will lock the shape. When you're happy with the shape, activate Solidify, then right-click and unstrengthen. Repeat this process for the remaining pieces. Take a moment to examine your work. Great, it's looking good. That's pretty much it for the pattern. Save your scene, then let's add some hardware and we'll be finished with this jacket. Select the button tool and click in the middle where our front stitching is. Under the Button tab, click Add to make a new button preset. Click on the two side pockets. Then adjust the preset to your liking. From here you can set the size, change the button shape, and change the color. Here I'm trying to set the button color to something that would complement the jacket. Everything's looking pretty good now. Save your final scene. For a final simulation, select the avatar. In the property editor, scroll to the bottom, expand Smooth Avatar, and enable Smooth. Simulate a final time. This will subdivide your avatar and project a smoother shape to your garment during simulations. This is especially helpful if your model is low-res enough to push faceted edges into your garment. And there you have it. Your garment is finished. Good job.